This taping was June the 6th, 1996, with Stew Webb, myself, and Darlene Novenger, former agent with the FBI. She was undercover. She was like being a CIA. She was the one that uncovered the Smatt Brothers, connections with George Herbert Walker Bush, then Vice President of the United States, and Jeb Bush out of Florida. She's now dead. Her mother's dead. Her father's dead. This was a radio program we had done together. I had hosted several shows for other people during the 1990s and had brought on several of the whistleblowers that had ties because there was money laundering back to Denver, Colorado, and Len Millman. This is Darlene's story.
Story down because of the time. I ran into corruption in the insurance industry in the Workmen's Compensation Division in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. One thing led to the other. In the pursuit of justice, I ran out of people after going to the governor and the Attorney General's office. I eventually was approached by the Organized Strike Force, which is federal, and the FBI, and was asked to actively work for them. Before that, I had no experience other than fighting for justice for my late husband. I was trained basically as a model and a singer, and had gotten married, and my husband became ill. And to condense the story a little further, I was at a point where I was promised that they might be able to help us obtain justice for my husband. In return, I would fit a profile of a person they were hunting for to do narcotics work in and out of the United States on political narcotics trafficking in southern Florida, Canada, Vermont, all over the East Coast and outside of the United States.
Now, when they came to you, Darlene, the FBI came to you and asked you to do this, did they tell you at that time this target of investigation was centered and focused around Donald Gregg, George Bush, Jeb Bush, or any of these people?
No, sir, they did not. In fact, it was depicted as I was in dire straits. My husband was in dire straits. They would, on occasion, my mom, who will be 76, would look in on my husband, and when she couldn't get there, the agents themselves, my husband had smoked because he was diagnosed as terminal from degenerative nerve deterioration from the inhalation of fumes. Never at any time was an international picture with high political officials depicted to me. It was simply, it sounded like you were just going to go around and pick up and ascertain information on various drug individuals who were narcotics traffickers. And in my wildest dreams, I would have never thought that it would lead to these high-ranking political people, which it did.
And what did you find, as an example, Darlene? You and I have worked together for several years now. And what did you actually find in your investigations that you focused on? And who were the people that you found involved in those investigations?
Okay, just so that it doesn't look like I was just thrown into this, I was taken, basically, and it sounds, and as corny as it might sound, it is the truth. When they rapped on the door from the crime force, they came from Washington, D.C. to recruit me actively. I was told I'd be trained. I was trained by their top people, some of which I can name because Billy Breen was one of their top operatives.
Now, Billy Breen has been named in a book, and you have too also, correct?
Billy did write his own book and called The Insider by the author's name is Goddard, for those folks who, it's in paperback, and Billy died of a brain tumor in 1991. He was trying to talk me into writing a book at that time, but Billy's life had been threatened, and by two people he claimed was in the FBI, and he threw his information to the New York Times in Washington, D.C., who locked it up in a vault, and Billy from there got the help to write his book, exposing the politicalness of the Department of Justice, which, to be quite truthful, leads back to the original question you asked me. The people that I ran into, I had, at the beginning, a very excellent relationship as far as a professional relationship with the Bureau until I ran into high-ranking political people who were involved in the narcotics trafficking business.
Such as?
George Bush, Jeb Bush, just to name a few people. They stand out in my mind because they have the most impact. Richard Thornburg's 5 U.S. attorneys, which I investigated, who were known cocaine users when they were in the Attorney General's office in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, who passed, by the way, an FBI security clearance, then were made assistants to then U.S. Attorney Dick Thornburg.
Dick Thornburg holding the same position as what now Janet Reno holds.
Yes. His right-hand man was an active, Henry Barr is his name, was convicted and had access to sensitive information of all ongoing narcotics operations in the United States, while at the same time using cocaine. Richard Gaida was convicted of distribution and use of cocaine. I might add, these gentlemen, two of these gentlemen, the two I'm speaking of here, received 6 months maximum in Allenwood, which is the country club, as a lot of the folks will probably be aware of the federal penitentiaries. And I might add that for traffic and distribution, Richard Gaida did not, none of his assets were ever frozen or taken, as they make it a, as you see on TV, anyone that has ever been convicted of distribution and selling cocaine, automatically their assets are frozen, taken from them, and sold at a public auction. Richard Gaida, in 1 year from, let's see, several months ago, applied for his law license to practice law and is expected to get it back this coming year.
We'll be back in a moment.
Well, it's happened, and even the major news media and establishment press is beginning to talk about the food shortages around the world and here in America. We're facing fighting at historic lows in the world's food supplies, perhaps barely more than a month, and there is little good news on the horizon. Prolonged drought has destroyed many of our
Good job.
whole state grain harvests are being quarantined.
We need your guest to speak up a little bit if she can.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's why they're letting the farmers.
I know.
In other words,
All right, once again, this is Stew Webb. I'm a federal whistleblower and informant. I'm filling in for Chuck Allen. And my guest is Darlene Novenger, a former FBI operative who had investigated the Jamaican drug connection involving top-level government officials of the Bush administration involved in narcotics trafficking into the United States. We were discussing, or you were discussing, Dick Thornburg and others, and Richard Gaida. I'll let you go on.
Okay. The interesting part, the thing that was plaguing me, and I'm sure the listeners in the United States, is the twofold system that we seem to have in this country, which I would have judged myself as a person who would have never actively been speaking out on these issues if you get to the point you see so much corruption, the pick and choose who we're going to prosecute mentality, that you can no longer morally work for these people. I resigned from taking assignments from these people and refused to do so on the grounds because of the selective prosecution and people, specifically the U.S. attorneys, that they were doing. I mean, we have eyewitnesses to people. They'll use cocaine one night doing lines openly in a nightclub, and Monday morning they're prosecuting, sending other people who are not holding political positions to jail for 20 to 30 years for the same crime.
Okay, as an example, when you busted, you were involved in we'll call it the bust, of Richard Guida and Barr. And this was when, and they were assistants to then Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, which was the highest bust ever of any government official being involved in narcotics themselves.
Yes.
And when you busted them, what you had discussed earlier pertaining to the amount of time that they spent in jail, under the 1988 Crime Control Act, how much time should they have actually served on the minimum maximum guidelines under federal law?
These gentlemen, number one, there was a reluctance to even prosecute them. Later on, they tried to discredit even myself in the middle of a hearing, which I might add, in the middle of the Richard Guida hearing, which they tried to discredit one of the people who had bought a pound of cocaine for Richard Guida in Florida and brought it back to Pennsylvania when he was a prosecutor. This actively was going on, and the Bureau knew about it from 1984. His trial did not get a conviction till 1991.
How much time should he have served actually in prison for what he did? Approximate number of years.
Basically, the man should have gotten at least 15 years.
And he ended up getting 6 months.
6 months.
And probation or whatever. And basically nothing taken from him, no assets taken or anything, and here he is involved in narcotics trafficking, assistant United States attorney.
Yes, which I find another disgrace to this country. And if that is not bad enough, he knows there was a show, Current Affairs, that I was on, I was asked to be on, by then an ex-congressman, Bailey.
That was, what, 1991, I believe? Or?
Yes, I believe so. And the Geraldo show, but that was on then George Bush, the George Bush, Jeb Bush, Jamaican connection, but not to confuse the two. But it's very interesting how these all intertwine. Mr. Guida and Henry Barr are now trying to regain their status and positions in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and have lashed out, I might add, with vengeance against, if they cannot get, their hands on me, they have victimized my mother, who will be 76 years old. It seems that once that you step on people's toes of this nature, you're relentlessly pursued by them. They try to discredit you. In this particular case, my late husband was taking a medication for pain for 6 years. When Mr. Guida was still at the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania, he found out I had it confirmed by drug users who told me personally. He knew who was investigating, who was on his trail, you might say. Through the mail came a petition for me to appear at a district justice for altering a drug prescription that went back 6 months ago for 15 pills. And I was looking at 6 years in jail in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Did you order any prescription?
I have never, and I've been polygraphed by people who work for the Bureau and other agencies. I have never committed a criminal offense in my life, nor have I ever altered anything or committed a criminal act. All I have been trained to do, and I was brought up, my grandfather was a minister. My mother had brought me up to believe that you do not commit criminal acts. What you reap is what you sow.
You're a born-again Christian, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
And just recently, I have been trying very desperately. They tried to get your hopes down. Things are still happening to us. My mom had lost everything she owned in a natural disaster in Pennsylvania. We're fighting tooth and nail, and I might add, a corrupt court system.
Okay, let's go back for a moment for the edification of the listeners here.
Okay.
Is they've killed your husband. They murdered your father because you were going to do a radio show with Tom Valentine, and you got a phone call the night before from a woman who's a known CIA Israeli Mossad hit woman.
Yes.
And they've murdered your father, or he ends up dead, the next day from doing that radio show. That was in 1993.
Right. 3 hours after that show, my father was found. I mean, the body, the estimated time of death was 3 hours after that. I received another call from her telling her how they did it and why it was done, and that I was to leave the country. That was the best thing I could do.
Okay, also to push up a little further, your mother's home that was in Pennsylvania was in an ice storm 2 years ago.
Right.
And during that ice storm, many of the roofs in Pennsylvania, because of the weight of the ice, collapsed, put holes in the roofs.
Right.
And the insurance company that you had at the time was Erie Insurance Company.
Yes.
And they never made a settlement with you to fix the house.
Right. And quite truthfully, they boarded the house shut in a collapsed state, and they left my mother and I live in a house that water poured over electrical wires. It was on television, on the local news, with beams that were collapsing, that we had to beg on a news show for someone to come and pay them, they would be paid to fix them. It was a horrendous condition that you would think that it looked like Bosnia, like the place took a shell. Inevitably, the house set, and it grew water between the walls, and microorganisms started to grow. We became ill from living there with no other place to go. At this point, my, let's say, investigative days, things were very, very bad because we had been run off the road. We have witnesses. You're depicted, they try to depict you as a kook and discredit you. What's interesting about this, I have all of this documented, and all I want is a fair hearing, and I want 12 jurors to take this in, because they are now fining my mother and letting this house stand, who's on a fixed income. We have both developed very severe health problems from inhaling the microorganisms that were in the house. And
these microplasms also, I might add, are almost identical to the same microplasms that are in what's known as Gulf War syndrome.
Yes, some of them are probably, unless you're into microbiology, are Stachybotrys, Cladosporium, just to name a few of these. We've had 4 to 5 known ones. We could could not get any of our possessions out. Everything is contaminated in the house. The insurance company now verified it's a biological waste site.
And they're going to have to take the house down or burn the house.
Right,
But the insurance company,
they will not pay.
but the insurance company will not pay on this.
Right.
Okay, why don't you get into the details of what you found in your investigations about Erie Insurance Company of Pennsylvania and their role in tied to the mafia there?
Okay, the Erie Insurance Company, my late husband, who thought the son Rose, believe me, he was very impressed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He thought that was a very, very big thing at the time. I'm not saying it as you well know, I've said this before, there are good people in that bureau, but their hands are tied. I can truly say that.
And that's because of what? The people at the very top?
That's right. The corruption. I would say that there are agents that would like to do something, but they know what happens. No one wants to lose family members, lose their jobs, have no means of supporting themselves, etc. The whole concept there is one. It's very grim at the moment, especially the way it's being run. I can only say that I feel sorry for them, but in the same token, I understand why they're reluctant. No one wants to get a family member murdered or killed. If I'd have known, quite truthfully, what I know now, I might have had second thoughts of working for these people myself, you know.
I understand. But we're going to have to take a break here, and we'll be right back with Darlene Novenger. Again, this is Stew Webb. I'm filling in for Chuck Allen, which I want to thank Chuck for the opportunity to do this. And my guest is Darlene Novenger, a former FBI operative who has investigated and was involved in the investigation of the exposure of George Bush, Jeb Bush, Arlen Specter, then governor, and later U.S. Attorney Dick Thornburg, and some of the top-level government officials involved in narcotics trafficking and usage in the United States. Now, Darlene, we were talking about Erie Insurance Company.
Yes.
And you had investigated basically a car theft ring and are aware of a car theft ring that they're involved with.
Yes, I did. It basically was ironic how this happened. I was working for the Bureau at the time. They were sitting in our living room. I had a daybed made for my late husband, and he was bedridden. And at that time, he, as I had mentioned, was an auto painter. And he had closed his business down and gone to work for another company. At that time, he ran into the information. Ironically, it came out of his mouth, which I was very surprised to hear, because I was more oriented towards and trained for narcotics trafficking. My late husband, Kevin Novenger, reported to the FBI and had all the information on it about this high car ring that reaches from Canada to Texas throughout the United States, specifically run by the Erie Insurance Company in a location on Peach Street in Erie, Pennsylvania. At that time, there was some sort of a shakeup, and a gentleman with the Catholic Church, not saying with no offense to anyone's religion, but a Father Peterson was then committed to an institution because he had knowledge of this car ring. The church some way was involved in Erie, Pennsylvania with the car ring. Most recently, it was brought up, a John Peterson, the president, seemed to be very, very spiteful about this information. and it's come back to haunt my mother. I realize that that is one of the reasons why her homeowner's claim is not being paid.
Now, I had a conversation when the Erie Insurance Company was not doing anything on your home, and I got involved with you. And I had a recorded conversation under federal law, of which I can record because of being a party to the conversation with parties with Erie Insurance.
Yes.
And after that conversation, and I had let them know that I would expose them immediately on the radio. What happened the next day? Do you recall?
There's been so much going on. In fact, we've had another incident today, but going back, what had happened was I had been shot at right after that. Of course, I think it was a scare technique because I'm sure they could have hit me, and thank God, they didn't. But I have been shot at. They called the FBI to open a record, and I know for a fact they have a running file to try to now depict me as some sort of a radical in a patriot movement. The same people who recruited me and trained me, I would know better than anyone how they operate, being that I work for them and what they have done. What's interesting about it was there was some activity with this going on. In one of the interrogatories, I cannot get a lawyer who's honest to represent us.
You're representing yourself currently in this case
For my mother.
For your mother, where Erie Insurance has not paid on this house because of an ice storm, and they have not paid because of their connections to the boys in Pennsylvania, meaning Dick Thornburg and Arlen Specter and the others.
Right, and an organized syndicate which operates between Buffalo, New York, and Erie, Pennsylvania, which I am presently have no choice but the way this is going. I'm going to make this allegation on June the 27th in a court hearing, unfortunately, that is in Cumberland County in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, on this particular case. And I am going to make the allegation that I feel that this, in fact, their corporate headquarters, they have one in this county. So far, I've accused them of committing perjury. The judge openly said on the phone to me, well, that's just an untruth and you can impeach him in court. And this is under discovery. So I sort of realize what I'm dealing with there, and I'm probably going to be forced with taking an appeal, and I will appeal this as far as I have to go to receive justice for my mother.
What it amounts to is Erie Insurance Company owes your mother about $100,000 for her home, of which they're refusing to pay.
And her clothing, yes.
And her clothing, and her furniture, etc. Because of you and your exposure of these top-level government officials when you yourself was working for the FBI and hired by the FBI to intentionally target political people.
That's correct.
Okay.
And now I have become a target myself by the people who should be, in my opinion, behind bars presently, not walking around doing talk shows themselves on Larry King. I might add, some of them have, and the other ones are now getting in the process of getting their law licenses back to practice, quote unquote, the law, which they have no idea what justice, in my opinion, really represents in the United States.
Okay, let's go a little further. Your husband's been killed, your father's been killed, your house is your mother's home, of which you were protecting your mother and living with her because of after your father being killed, has been destroyed.
Yes.
Your cars, you've had 2 cars that were involved in floods, correct?
Right. One was vandalized. Now, the insurance company, the car that I left at the garage in Pennsylvania when her time was up at this hotel where she had nowhere to live and I was moving her, one of the cars broke down when the snow started melting this past February.
Was this from the vandalism that constantly went on during that period to your automobiles?
Right, and I called a garage, and we were to leave that morning, and it was towed. The garage owner did not say why he couldn't keep it out of the flood, but the car was in the flood. Now the insurance company that I am insured with is
Allstate, correct?
State Farm.
Or State Farm.
Refuses to give me an amount to replace my car, which is comparable to book value on that. So every time, every inch of the way, it seems that they seem to be just trying to financially break your back. So we're incurring medical cost
from having
the exposure to this home,
which is the possibility of having, with the microplasms and the other things,
yes,
possibly Gulf War syndrome. We'll be right back.
Comparable to that.
We'll be right back with Darlene Novenger. Once again, we're back. This is Stew Webb. I'm filling in for Chuck Allen, and I'm interviewing Darlene Novenger, who's a former FBI operative. There is a difference, folks, between an operative and an agent. I'll let Darlene explain that real quick, and then we'll go back with our interview.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, Stu. The difference of an operative is a person who basically works not because you've ever been convicted of a crime.
Like sometimes a federal informant snitch.
People will plea bargain and go to work for the Bureau or another agency because they have something on them or whatever, or they've been caught in a crime.
There are sometimes also, for the edification of the listeners, other people such as myself being informants where I've testified where I was never involved with anything, but yet testified against Bush and others in a courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Right. Yes. In other words, you have no criminal background. They do background checks on your family. And at the time, it seems that you come through with shining colors, and when you find something political out, all of a sudden things change a little bit, and they go on to a program to try to depict you and make you look like you're making all of this up or whatever.
Okay, but the difference between actual informant and actual FBI agent is what?
Okay, an operative can actually go in and out of the country on behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and basically do things where an agent would be restrained from doing them.
And during the time that you were an operative, you left the country. You were investigating what was known as the Jamaican drug connection, which was part of Iran-Contra.
That's correct.
Okay, and during that period of time, you were investigating, in particular, George Bush and Jeb Bush and others that you did not know, which later I helped fill some pieces, Donald Gregg and others for you, who was then Vice President. George Bush's, then when George Bush was Vice President, he was head of the Vice President's National Security Agency.
That's correct. When I was in Miami, I had no idea that George Bush's name was ever going to surface until I was at a very high-ranking drug lord's home, and it came up. And I had seen communications, phone calls coming in from the Republican Party in Miami. It was so shocking. I had been polygraphed by so many people, and have, I might add, passed all of them. Plus, I had no reason to make something that would make my life a nightmare and cost me my family members' lives. I asked the Bureau, I said, you investigate and prove this wrong. I said, this is one of the most horrendous things I have ever heard of. This at the time was the Vice President of the United States and his son. I found that at the time to be very shocking. Since then, I've learned so much more about more political people that it's just more disgusting than shocking now.
Okay, in particular, like George Bush, you know from communications with these top-level drug dealers that you were investigating that George Bush himself was using narcotics.
Yes, at that time period when he was vice president in '82, there was pharmaceutical-grade cocaine going from Miami to the office of the vice president. That was a direct statement that was taken by one of the drug dealers' couriers right to the vice president's office.
Okay. Second, George Bush was also involved in condominiums in Puerto Rico.
That's correct, and in Jamaica.
And did you know of prostitutes being delivered or prostitutes that George Bush was involved with in those two countries?
The statement was made to me by this drug lord that they were furnished at his home to Mr. Bush and his son, and they're at various hotels in the Miami area. And
you're referring to his son being Jeb Bush,
who is going to be running again for governor of Florida. Your guest needs to speak up. We can't hear her.
Darlene, could you speak up? They're having a little problem hearing you.
Surely.
We'll go back to the question. George Bush was involved with prostitutes.
That's correct.
Please answer it again and raise your voice just a little they're having a little problem with the station there.
The drug lord who I was speaking to made the statement to me on how much
We'll be right back with Darlene Novenger. Once again, this is Stew Webb filling in for Chuck Allen, and I'm interviewing Darlene Novenger. We're going to be coming to the top of the hour here soon. Darlene would rather not give out her number where people can contact her, but anybody wanting to get in touch with Darlene, they can call me direct at my home number. It's 702-360-3008. That's 702-360-3008. Now, Darlene, you were talking about the prostitutes and so forth, and they were having a little trouble hearing of Jeb Bush and George Bush. Will you expand upon that?
Yes. How that was brought up was the fact that I was talking about, what was interesting about this, everyone was aware, which I always was very acutely worried about, my husband's case of him being ill, and this was used as sort of like a foot in the door tactic, so I would be under less scrutiny by these people. And the court system got brought up, and I said, I made a funny statement to this drug lord, because I said, all I'm hunting for is justice, and I was being quite truthful about this in the course of the conversation, at which point he got hysterical and said, my dear, the only justice exists in this country is how much money you have and how you can control. There is no such thing as justice. Justice comes from your wallet. And I said, what do you mean by that? And thus, that is how the name George Bush, Jeb Bush, came up to me. I will never forget that day as long as I live. And it is a day that has changed my life forever. And I just could not believe how the acceptance of the people, why they let this go on in the United States.
And the people that you're referring to are FBI agents themselves, special agent charge, as an example, in Pennsylvania and other places where you were reporting back to them the evidence that you found against these top-level officials, meaning the Vice President, then George Bush, and top-level government officials such as United States Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorneys, etc.?
That's correct. And the shows that I have done to try people, it's very hard for them to conceive that people would not be caught. You would think if they're doing all this illegal activity, how is it going on in this country? Well, I think a lot of people might have the answer to that because if you reach a certain level and that person has a political position, and let's say you have a problem or they have a son or a daughter, and let's say they get into trouble, I don't think that many of us see their sons going to war, the top politicians, no more than they send them to the penitentiary. All of us are not perfect in this world, but I think that the American people deserve a lot more in our leaders.
In other words, we have a shadow government operating inside the government of the United States of America.
That's correct.
And is this government there to protect those top-level government officials and former top-level government officials that are involved in narcotics, etc.?
Yes, it acts as a damage control agent to shield the very people that we're discussing.
We'll be right back.
This taping was June the 6th, 1996, with Stew Webb, myself.